Welcome back to the studio and to Media Storm, the news podcast that starts with the people who are normally asked last.
Today we are discussing domestic abuse and how it is portrayed in the mainstream media. And with us is a very special guest.
She is an award-winning feminist activist, writer, and co-director of gender justice organisation Level Up. She has spearheaded the UK's first media guidelines on responsibly reporting on domestic homicide, now backed by all media regulators and many newsrooms. She is Janey Starling. Hi, Janey.
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Good. I feel like it's always important to check in with each other before discussing a topic this heavy, which we did at the beginning of this episode as well. Spoke about the heaviness of this topic, but also the amazing stories that come through it and the resistance and uplifting people. So we can't wait to get chatting with you. We just heard my investigation into the failure to protect women with insecure immigration status from domestic abuse. And part of what we heard through the stories of these women is that domestic abuse is not always physical. But if you looked in the mainstream media, you may not always see that. Do you think that the mainstream media often fails to portray domestic abuse as anything other than physical?
I think as a society, we fail to understand that domestic abuse is a public health problem. And actually, so much of domestic abuse is about power and control, and that's psychological. And so, you know, I specialize in domestic homicide, which is when someone has killed their partner or ex-partner. And we know that one of the greatest predictors of whether someone is going to kill their partner is extremely jealous, possessive, controlling behaviors and attitudes. So, you know, obviously these things are less easy to put in a picture. You can't take photos of psychological abuse or coercive control, because what it looks like is, you know, someone constantly belittling their partner, somebody checking the petrol receipts to see if someone had actually gone to the petrol station at the time that they said they would, someone checking their partner's phone, having access to their emails, constant kind of surveillance and monitoring that is so unhealthy, but has become the norm in a very unhealthy relationship. And the end goal ultimately is to have total control over another person.
Can you just explain what you mean by we fail to see domestic abuse as a public health issue?
So, you know, I'm looking at this through the lens of media reporting, and I think what's really interesting is that there are very strict media regulations on the reporting of suicide, for example, because we've established as a country, and the media knows that it has, you know, a preventive duty when it comes to suicide, because the media understands that if they report on, for example, a celebrity death, and they're not allowed to report the methods used or excessive detail because they could influence people to take the same methods, to take their own life. However, the logic doesn't extend to fatal domestic abuse when, you know, every week 2 women are murdered by a partner or ex-partner. And yet in the press, too often it's reported as this out of the blue, isolated incident that's just happened, rather than situated contextually in a society where a lot of relationship norms are quite unhealthy, and we need to start talking about them if we want to stop women dying.
So if we fail to see it as a public health issue, then we fail to take a preventative approach.
Exactly.
And
that.
actually, yeah, when I think about, okay, what stories have I seen in the media about it? The examples that jump to mind are names everyone knows. It's Sabina Nessa and Sarah Everard. These are women who were killed by violent male strangers. And what I can't think of are many examples of women being killed in the far more common circumstance where they're being killed by someone they know. Why do you think that the media only shows those more extreme and unusual circumstances and not the everyday dangers that maybe we need to be more alert to?
It's such a good question, and I think the media is, you know, cause and consequence of our cultural understandings of what violence looks like. And I think, you know, we do have this quite skewed stranger danger narrative of gendered violence where, you know, we're all, as women, we're all used to kind of, when you're walking home, looking over your shoulder, but we're so fixated on that. as a society that we forget that the person who's most likely to kill you is your partner. You know, many of the cases we see in our rolling news every single week are women who are murdered by the men who they've been married to for 10, 20 years, have families with. And actually, what we need to be looking at is coercive behavior, jealous attitudes, possession. And ultimately, that's why, you know, the guidelines that Level Up have created really do attempt to get these stories into the press in a way that shows the full context, because actually articles that are accurate and responsible can save women's lives.
Talking about context also, often in the media and very often in headlines, and we will obviously get to this a little bit later, we also hear the framing of excuses. We hear it was mental health, it was lockdown, it was drugs, it was alcohol. And I suppose my question is, how can we report on those important contexts without using them as an excuse for violent behavior?
So, you know, remembering that domestic abuse is about power and control is the number one thing to keep in mind. And ultimately, yes, like lots of people struggle with their mental health. Yes, lots of people struggle with substance use, but neither mental health or substance use drive someone to have a controlling mindset. And ultimately, you know, those myths really deflect accountability away from an individual's actions and their, you know, deeply rooted behaviors and attitudes. And I think what's really sad is it does reinforce stigma against people who do have mental illnesses, who do have substance use issues, when actually we really need to separate them, because, you know, you can struggle with mental health and not kill your partner.
Right.
Is this a question that I'm allowed to ask? What is the thing that makes someone kill their partner?
So there's lots of academic evidence, and, you know, criminologists have long established that domestic homicide, fatal domestic abuse, someone killing their partner, is the end point to a sustained period of coercive control. And, you know, there's a brilliant criminologist called Professor Jane Monckton-Smith who has, you know, reviewed hundreds and hundreds of domestic homicide cases, and she's mapped a progressive 8-stage homicide timeline that has specific kind of triggers and points of escalation. And what we do know is that, you know, the number one thing is jealous behavior, a controlling attitude, seeking to possess a partner as, you know, property rather than an individual in their own right. And we also know that, you know, 89% of women are murdered within a year of separating from the partner, because ultimately, if the desire is to seek control over someone and someone flees the relationship, the perpetrator will then seek to gain ultimate control by taking someone's life. This is why, you know, looking at separation, and often in the media when we see stories about estranged husbands, it's because there has been an abusive partner, the victim has left, and then they've hunted them down and killed them.
So it's about control, and in most situations it's about male control of women.
In all situations, it's about male control of women.
Okay, so let's talk about what that actually looks like in the media.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most sensitive areas of reporting on domestic abuse is imagery.
Mm-hmm.
And I often find it quite jarring how the picture layout is done in these articles. The template seems to be a large centered photo of the perpetrator and a small inset photo of the victim. And I swear, ever since I was a little girl, I used to just have these kind of nightmarish flashes of my face on one of those pages. Just that layout, there's something so disturbing about it. Can you explain what that is?
You know, I've been working with victims' families for almost a decade now, and I think the number one thing they all say is they want the newspaper reporting on their loved one's death to be a memorial for the victim and not propaganda for the perpetrator. And too often what we see is when journalists are kind of in a misguided way trying to hold the perpetrator accountable, they prioritize the killer. And actually, this is a public record of someone's life and death, and the victim too often becomes a footnote in their own death. Ultimately, that's what the guidelines are seeking to change, but far too often we see perpetrators centered, and we also see, you know, image editors kind of make these composite pictures of the victim and the perpetrator side by side.
That's so jarring.
It's really inappropriate, and it's really insensitive to the victim's family. There's so much to say on images, but we will always say send to the victim, make it, honor her life, honor who she was as a person before her life was taken from her.
And there's also something to be said, I think, about the images that are selected. Now, often there will be images put out into the public domain by the police or various authorities, or by the family of the victim. But some papers, they do unfortunately sometimes trawl through the victim's social media and pull up photos that for some reason they deem more appropriate. I wonder if you've seen that a lot in your work.
We've seen it time and time again, and it's one of the most distressing things that families talk about, is where when you've lost someone you love, you're already in like a free fall of grief, and you've lost total control. You're trying to figure out, coroners and funerals and childcare arrangements and police proceedings, and to provide the police with an image of your loved one to put out to the press, and then find out that, oh no, a journalist has decided to go through your nephew's Facebook account to find a picture of your now deceased sister at a party 5 years ago because she was wearing a mini dress. That's the image that they've chosen to present your loved one as, rather than the one that you want your loved one to be remembered as. It's such a intimate violation that really, really stays with families. There was a man whose sister had been murdered, who it turned out the press had found a picture of her in her bikini on a holiday, and that was the image that they chose to prioritize over the picture that the family had issued. It's just one of the many ways that the press has historically violated dead women's dignity. One of the examples I can also give is a Muslim woman called Raneem Uday, who was murdered with her mum by her, again, partner who she'd left. And the picture that the family issued to the press was one of her sitting in a restaurant wearing her hijab. That was not the picture that ended up being disseminated across the media. What had happened is a journalist at one publication had trawled through her Facebook and found a picture of her without her hijab.
No. I was thinking that's surely not how this story's going to end.
Yeah, that's what has happened.
So they broadcast a photo of her without her hijab.
Yes.
Actually makes me want to cry. That's such a violation.
And we've also seen, newspapers get mock-up pictures of the murder weapon that's been used. It's such a thoughtless way to report on someone's death that ultimately traumatizes the family and intrudes into their grieving process.
I think some journalists might feel like they are holding perpetrators to account because they're splashing their pictures across the front pages and saying, isn't this person so awful?
True.
What would you say to that?
Accountability is on the terms of the victim. So when the victim's family is saying, we want truth, we want justice, we want you to report on our loved one's death, we want accuracy, it's really not hard for journalists to do that. Ultimately, what ends up happening is they center the perpetrator and the perpetrator's narrative, and the victim becomes a footnote.
Also, some perpetrators might want to be pictured, and I don't know if people really think about that, because I certainly didn't until I started doing much more research into this type of reporting.
I think one of the most disturbing things that I've heard throughout the course of working with families is that, so I work closely with brothers called Luke and Ryan Hart, whose mum, Claire, and sister Charlotte were murdered by their father in 2016. Now, when the police seized their father's computer, they found that for months preceding the murders, he had been searching for articles online of men who had killed their families. So he was seeking justification for his worldview, for what he was about to do, and he wanted to know how he would be reported on. And he found a lot of validation. He found a lot of, what he was feeling actually being justified in the press. So it is really important to remember that just as much as it's important to, report with dignity for victims, it's equally as important to remember that there could be future perpetrators reading your report and finding sympathy for their cause in your reporting. And I don't think any journalist would ever intend that or want that. But without sensitivity and without understanding, it happens.
So let's get into the specifics of what that looks like on paper, so listeners know when what they're seeing is not what they should be seeing. I think that headlines are often where a lot of the mishaps happen. You don't have to look far to find headlines on these topics using terms like jilted lover or hubby. And what that does is it frames these incidents in a romanticized narrative. You mentioned Professor Jane Monckton Smith. So she wrote Murder, Gender and the Media, right?
Yeah, she did.
And the research in her book also shows that men who are convicted for killing their partners, if they use the term love in their trial, they are more likely to get lighter sentences. Do you think that editorial decisions like headlines using terms like jilted lovers feed or risk feeding into the hands of the perpetrator?
Absolutely. There is, one of the number one cultural problems that we have around domestic abuse is that these are acts of love, which is crazy. It's crazy to think that, murdering someone is an act of love, but somewhere like deeply embedded in our cultural history, if you think of Romeo and Juliet, these narratives of masculinity that manifest in murder are not loving in any way. And I think, some of the articles that triggered this campaign back in 2017-18 were very much along those lines. I've got a couple of them here. So hubby guilty of murdering his wife over row over her lesbian tryst. Jilted lover stole M4 rifle and executed estranged wife, her mum and pet dog when she refused to rekindle. And using words like hubby, jilted, lover, rekindle, it's so insidious. And I think the second thing I'll say is that these headlines always hinge the murder around a woman's actions. It's always
her lesbian, what was it?
After her lesbian tryst or after a row.
This is it. It's always pinned, there's such a typical framework where it's just like romanticized male figure kills woman after her actions and make the actions as salacious as possible. And it's just such an inaccuracy because, the true context and character of these relationships and these deaths is the fact that a controlling man has, hunted down a woman after she's left him to take her life.
What publications are these from?
They're from across the spectrum. I wish I could tell you that it's from, tabloids, but it's not. It's not. There's an endemic problem across the press. And we have seen movement on it. But to come back to the point around romanticization, there was some really good research published from Germany earlier this year, which showed that, some academics did reader testing on different framings of men killing their partners. The two frames were, one was really factual and criminological. It was, talking about a killing, talking about a murder. The other one framed the event as a love killing. And it found that in readers who had read the reports of love killings, quote unquote, they felt more sympathy for the perpetrator and less for the victim. So we really do need to disrupt and completely, divorce murder from love because it's never, ever a justification.
At risk of going down a rabbit hole, how does this discussion we're having around romanticizing these crimes, how does this criticism feed into true crime? Like, what are your feelings around true crime and how much it obsesses about violent crimes against women?
I don't really tune into true crime, so I don't really know that much. I think my understanding is that too often focuses on perpetrators rather than victims. And ultimately what I've seen from working with families around domestic homicide is that we focus far too much on the perpetrators. There's this psychological fascination with the mindset of the perpetrator, which I think comes from a morbid curiosity, but is ultimately quite unhelpful in often kind of giving them more of a space and a platform than they deserve.
Yeah.
I think a big question that needs to be asked then is the media, is the press afraid of naming the crime accurately? Because we did an episode on Media Storm Series 1, which was called Rape Justice, What Happens to 98%. And in our conversation with our two brilliant guests, Layla Hussein and Gina Martin, we had a real focus on the language used to describe gender-based violence and sexual violence. And often these phrases that come up are underage woman, sex with a 14-year-old, non-consensual sex. And then when we looked at it, we were like, well, non-consensual sex is rape. Sex with a 14-year-old is statutory rape. And there's no such thing as an underage woman. It's a girl, it's a child. And so I wonder if you see the same in fatal domestic abuse reporting, and why the media might be so afraid to just name the crime accurately.
I think, you know, there are obviously limitations around the justice process. So you do have to wait until there's been a conviction. But once there is a conviction, it is domestic abuse. It is murder. You can say that, and we should say that, because being able to contextualize these deaths within the spectrum of domestic abuse, which is constantly escalating, is the key to prevention. Because as it stands right now, we have a real problem where if a man kills his partner and kills himself, the journalists see, oh, there's been a suicide. We need to follow the suicide guidelines really carefully, and we need to put the Samaritan's helpline at the bottom. We need to be conscious of whatever mental health issues he might have had. And the woman is completely like left aside. And what's really important is that we know that accurate information about public health issues assists prevention. And when it comes to domestic abuse, there will be potential victims, current victims who might recognize, oh, well, my partner's really controlling. My partner's threatened to kill me. I really want to leave my partner, but I don't know how I'm going to do it. Being able to signpost to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline could save someone's life. If every article on a domestic abuse killing signposted to the helpline, just that.
And that's such a simple fix. I mean, we've seen that universally across suicide reporting. That's, I don't really know what the argument against it would be.
There is no argument against it, which is why we've had really positive uptake for the guidelines. And we do see more newsrooms putting the helpline there. But, you know, just that small shift in newsroom behaviour has been really helpful, and there's so much more they could do.
Good.
Well, talking about newsroom behaviour,
I mean the biggest trap that newsrooms fall into, that comes up in every Media Storm episode, it's the impact of the fast-paced news cycle. So the demand for kind of instant news means that often reporters are just grabbing stories from news wires, changing a few words and slapping it up on the website as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, these are being given headlines that do less to reflect accurately the contents of the story and more for SEO, search engine optimization, for anyone the hell listening lucky enough not to know what that is. And I wonder how that plays into this issue of domestic abuse reporting.
When someone's been murdered by their partner or ex-partner, there is breaking news, and then there's a trial, and then once there's been a conviction. And I think we see the timeline, the reporting gets better and better and more accurate. There's such a trade-off between urgency and accuracy. So at the beginning, you know, when a woman's been found dead or a man has been charged, there are very scant details, and, you know, the police will issue a very scant press release. But the problems come when journalists try to fill in the gaps in information quite recklessly, because they want to be the first to break the news. And what we see then is journalists going to interview a neighbour down the road, journalists taking a picture of the house and putting it online. You know, we see these invasions into privacy, and ultimately too many sound bites from neighbours who did not know the true character of that relationship, which are ultimately unhelpful. But some of the best reporting, and there is really good reporting on fatal domestic abuse, comes after the conviction, often a couple of years down the line, when families are ready to speak and they want to detail their case. And it is possible, when journalists do have all the information, they can write brilliant reports.
So I wonder, because when the press wires come through, often if somebody's writing an article just based on the perpetrator's defense, that can seem really sympathetic to the perpetrator. So the only thing is, having been in a newsroom, I wonder, like, what would it take for somebody to be like, well, no, we're going to hold that story. We're not going to print that story. Like, what would it take for a newsroom to do that? Because I don't know about you, Mathilda, but I don't know if I can see that happening. Like, it would take such integrity, and
it would take a backlash. It would take a really embarrassing mishap being called out by enough of the audience for them to think twice the next time around.
Which is quite sad.
We see fewer and fewer, and I think the most important thing that journalists have to remember is that dead women don't get the right of reply. So ultimately, it's your job to provide balance. It's your job to ensure impartiality. Reporting a defense narrative is not impartial, but the prosecution always comes before the defense. There's nothing stopping you from referencing the prosecution. There's nothing stopping you from actually providing balance. And I do think on the whole, we are seeing fewer and fewer of those kind of reports because they are going out of fashion and public discourse is moving ahead. And, you know, if we look at the murder of Emma Pattinson earlier this year, the public outrage compared to what it would be 5 years ago was really impressive. You know, 5 years ago, no one was talking about this stuff unless it was feminist corners of the internet. But now, you know, there was broad public disgust at the headline from the Mail that centered her partner. And I think that is an indication that society is moving on and newspapers need to catch up.
Just to outline what that story was, Emma Patterson was the head teacher at Epsom College.
Yeah.
Private school, one of the reasons it probably got so much press attention. And the headline and the speculation that followed the breaking of the story, which was a media feeding frenzy. It was, you know, 5-minute updates on everyone's homepage. It was speculation around him being threatened by his wife's high-powered job and not being able to cope with, you know, the pressures that her job brought to the household. And yeah, there was a backlash, rightfully so, against the implications of that. But we have got a few more examples, and I don't think we're going to be short of content here.